Hello, everyone. Welcome. Can you hear me? Great. I'd like to welcome you to this inaugural panel of this event. So I'm happy to introduce our essays here. I'm Tim O'Malley. I'm the Associate Director for Research at the McGrath Institute for Church Life here at Notre Dame. And I'll go through and introduce each of the titles. Each person will have 20 minutes, followed by some time for dialogue and questions. We'll move from my left, I believe, straight through to the end. So we'll begin with my colleague, Josh McManaway at the University of Notre Dame, who will speak on Mihi, Quaestio, Factus sum, the theme of self-knowledge in Augustine and Greene. Then we welcome Father Maximilian, who will speak on, well, actually, that's not in the right order, so we will, do you want to go in that order?
No, the way it is fine.
Okay, great. I just want to, well, it's up to you all. You get to determine. The Double Life of the Catholic Priest, a primer for the coincidence of opposites in the Catholic literary imagination. And lastly, Rachel Sherlock, The Ends of the Affairs, Medieval Ideals, Modern Trysts, and the offering of redemption in the works of Greene and T.H. White. So welcome our paper readers, and let's get started. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, friends. This paper is about two literary retrospectives on very different lives. St. Augustine of Hippo in his Confessions, and the fictional first-person narrator of Graham Greene's The End of the Affair, an author and serial adulterer, Maurice Bendrix. Both offer an attempt at making sense of the events of their lives, though with nearly opposite amounts of success. While Augustine comes to see himself and his life in the light of God's providence and understands the events of his life as a concrete account of God's love, Bendrix fails to understand even his own thoughts and motivations, and is, until the end of the book, an unreliable narrator. The difference between the two could fill volumes, and I only have 20 minutes, so I'll have to be narrow. I will discuss Augustine's Confessions, and in particular, the famous theft of the pears. This, I believe, is a story central to Augustine's understanding of himself as one in relation to God. Next, I will turn to Bendrix and his inability to account for himself or his motives, precisely because he does not see himself in relation to the God who is love. St. Augustine of Hippo began writing his Confessions in the year 397, having been a priest for only 6 years and the sole bishop of Hippo for only 1. How had such a life led to the episcopacy of this North African town? Such a question was raised not only by Augustine, who marveled at God's mercy in making him a bishop, but by Augustine's critics throughout North Africa. Why this guy? In the opening book of the Confessions, Augustine orients the book in the only way that makes sense, towards God. The opening line of the book, borrowed from Psalm 47, begins, Manus est Domine, et laudabilis valde. Great are you, O Lord, and greatly to be praised. This line contextualizes the entire work. The book is not a confession that lays bare every scintillating detail of his life. Rather, it is a book about God's providence and the particularity of a life, Augustine's life. The opening chapter of the book is often a difficult one for my students, as Augustine begins with a series of questions to God. Quote, "Who calls upon you when he does not know you? Do heaven and earth contain you because you have filled them? Or do you fill them and overflow them because they cannot contain you? Is the whole of you everywhere, yet without anything that contains you entire?" These are good questions, interesting questions even, but may catch the unprepared reader off guard. The two questions that I think dominate the rest of the Confessions are also asked in this opening book. Augustine inquires, at the end of a litany of difficult questions on the nature of God, "Who then are you, my God? Quid est ergo Deus meus?" He answers with a list of divine attributes. deeply hidden yet intimately present, immutable and yet changing all things, never new, never old, making everything new. But God is not simply a list of divine attributes. Augustine notably addresses this God as my God, as someone not simply to be understood, but to be encountered and known. And he therefore asks the second question that rounds out this pair. Who are you to me? Quid mihi es? I got a classics degree, so I have to read Latin as often as I can in public to let my parents know it was really worth it. For Augustine, this God is not a hyper-transcendent monad who is merely a jumble of divine attributes, someone who is out there, up there, far beyond the woes and worries of the lives of real human people. No, for Augustine, this God is one who stands in relation to Augustine himself. Who are you to me? This, of course, invites the question, what am I to you, God? Perhaps the most famous line from the work also comes from this book. Quote, you stir man to take pleasure in praising you, because you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. Augustine makes the rather bold claim that a human life is meant for the praise of God, and that it finds its ultimate meaning in God. All other meanings are relativized in light of this meaning. Relativized, but also elevated by God's grace. The conversations Augustine has that lead him to God find their ultimate end in God. The books that Augustine reads along his intellectual journey, Cicero's Hortensius, the books of the Platonists, these books are all folded into God's divine plan to reunite himself to Augustine. Conversely, all false attempts at finding meaning in anything but God will fall short, since all meaning that the human mind can discover becomes disclosed within the horizon of God's providence. For the sake of time, I will look at an episode in Augustine's life that is allegedly devoid of meaning, in order to show that even there, the Christian can find meaning within this aforementioned horizon. It is easier to view one's life through Christian lenses and to see the hand of providence nudging you to this book that guided you along your intellectual journey, or that conversation with a person whose presence in your life was a boon. But what of sin? Can a vision graced by God look back and find coherence and intelligibility even in sin? Let's turn now to the story of the theft of the pears in Book 2 of the Confessions to see if even that can be understood. In his 16th year, Augustine's father did not quite have the funds to pay his tuition, and so he came back to his hometown and took what might be called a gap year, were Augustine more posh. While back home with his hooligan friends, they set out one night to steal some pears from a local farmer's tree and feed them to the pigs instead of enjoying the pears themselves, with Augustine noting that he had better pears at home. Augustine holds this sin, of all his possible sins, as somehow paradigmatic of sin in general. If you know other aspects of Augustine's biography, you may wonder why he chose this, and not, say, having a child out of wedlock and abandoning his mistress. Poor form. Whether the sin were as major as Augustine thought, what does it have to do with Augustine's retrospective on his life in light of God's providence? Augustine laments in prayer to God that he had, quote, become evil for no reason. I had no motive for my wickedness except wickedness itself. Many readers of Augustine will stop their investigation here, claiming that sin at root is simply irrational, and that's that. As they rightly point out, for Augustine, sin is the privatio boni, there's that Latin working for me again, the privation of good. It has no being itself, but is instead parasitical on the good. It is therefore nothing. Had Augustine stopped here, one might be justified in such thinking. Sure, conversations with Ambrose or Monica and the books of the Platonists fall under God's providence, but this sin as a no thing is just irrational all the way down. There's no accounting for it. And yet, Augustine presses on and interrogates his sin, asking it, quote, what did I love in you, my act of theft, that crime which I did at night? Augustine addresses his sin much as he addresses God at the outset of this book. But this is odd. How can one address nothing? Indeed, how can no thing be the cause of anything at all? It cannot be. Augustine recognizes that something else underlies his sin. Some other desire motivates him. and this desire cannot be for nothing, since desire is always desire for something. Further in Book 2, Augustine notices how the vices so often seem to ape divine virtues. Avarice wishes to have so many possessions, but God possesses everything. Pride imitates what is lofty, but God is the Most High. What then accounts for the nature of the pleasure in the theft of the pears, since, as Augustine remarks, the act itself, quote, has nothing lovely about it? Why then did he do it? He admits, quote, if I had been alone, I would not have done it. It was for the sake of friendship, which is to say for the sake of community, though a community founded on the basis of sin. Just as pride tries to imitate God's being almighty, so too did Augustine's little gang of pear thieves imitate, in their own cheap way, the society of God, which is to say the Trinity itself. Whereas God is a perfect communion of persons, held together eternally in a bond of charity, Augustine sought an imitation of such a society in a bond of larceny. It is precisely in retrospect, with an answer to the question, who are you to me, that Augustine can answer the question, why did I steal the pears? Augustine sees how even his sins arise from the human heart's desire for God. Augustine wanted to be like God, which is precisely why Augustine's sin of pear thievery and his insight into sin follows the paradigm of Adam's sin, who reached for the forbidden fruit in an attempt to be like God without a relationship with God. Such is the root of all sins, Augustine realizes. Even something which is seemingly senseless, the privation of a good, a no thing that cannot account for itself, can be understood in the light of God's providence, because it was God that Augustine was reaching for, though ignorantly and through the wrong means. It is important to note that Augustine's own motives were hidden from him until he was able to answer the question, who are you to me? No aspect of Augustine, however interior, could be understood by himself until he understood himself in relation to God. This finds resonance with Sarah Miles's statement in The End of the Affair, that, quote, you, God, were there teaching us to squander, like you taught the rich man, so that one day we might have nothing left except this love of you. I think it's the best line in the novel. God allowed Augustine and Sarah both to spend themselves on their sins, only to realize that at the end of it all, the thing they were desiring in their sins was God himself. But my paper, unfortunately, does not address Sarah. Rather, I turn to her lover, Maurice Bendrix, whose story is considerably more confused than Augustine's. Bendrix's insistence on an unconsidered nihilism reduces all occurrences in his life to mere coincidence, his favorite word to describe the miraculous throughout the story. As a writer, Bendrix is extraordinarily unliterary in his account of the world, as he is uncurious to a fault, as though Rex Mottram from Brideshead had pursued a literary career and found middling success. The opening line of The End of the Affair shows how unliterary Bendrix is. He says, quote, a story has no beginning or end. Arbitrarily, one chooses that moment of experience from which to look back or from which to look ahead. The disjointed, non-linear flow of the book supports the assertion that the story he tells is one that even he does not understand. As an author, he is nevertheless blind, not just to the thoughts and motivations of the other characters, but his own thoughts and motivations. Indeed, he is not even sure what he writes is true, as he reports in the beginning of Book 2. Quote, if this book of mine fails to take a straight course, it is because I am lost in a strange region. I have no map. I sometimes wonder whether anything that I am putting down here is true. And he has good reason to doubt the veracity of his words. He opens the book by saying that it is a record of hate, though by Book 2, he reconsiders and writes, quote, I am not convinced. Perhaps my hatred is really as deficient as my love. Only a few pages earlier, he muses, quote, sometimes I don't recognize my own thoughts. Bendrix is a mystery to himself, a question that he refuses to look at and remains incapable of answering. He is likewise at every turn unskilled at interpreting the motives of those around him, especially Sarah. There is the crucial scene in the book when Bendrix lay unconscious, buried under the rubble from a V1 bomb, and Sarah was on her knees in his bedroom, praying for God to restore his life, promising that she would give up her affair with him if only God would give Bendrix more life. Bendrix comes upstairs to find Sarah there, crouched in prayer. From her own diary that we get to read in book 4, we know that Sarah presses her nails into her hands in cruciform love and begs God to help her believe enough to warrant her prayer to him. When she looks up to find Bendrix alive, her prayer answered, she explains her own reaction. Quote, "Now the agony of being without him starts, and I wished he was safely dead again under the door." Yet when Bendrix recounts the story, he misinterprets her facial expression as that of disappointment, that he was no longer dead, because he suspected she had desired to move on, guilt-free, and to have another affair with a mysterious and unnamed person. To add another layer to his misinterpretation, Bendrix had earlier said that Sarah was, quote, unhaunted by guilt, unlike the rest of us. Thus, even on Bendrix's own description of Sarah as one who lives without guilt, his interpretation of her facial expression as he met her after the bomb explosion makes no sense. His understanding of Sarah is one who has no such compunction about changing lovers. So why would it matter whether Bendrix were alive or dead if she had decided to have another affair? Such misperceptions about others are the symptoms of a lack of self-knowledge. While Bendrix claims to really love Sarah, especially compared to Henry's harmless pleasantness towards her, Bendrix nevertheless can never remember her as anything other than a sexual object. Every single reminiscence of Sarah in the book is bound up in the act of sex and that alone. The goal of every encounter with her is sex, even when she is dying, and Bendrix chases her into the church where they have their last encounter, Bendrix groping her in the pew while she sits exhausted from her prolonged illness. After her death, Bendrix lashes out at God, who has won in the end by taking Sarah's life. But he reminds God with an impotent taunt that he, Bendrix, was the one who had penetrated Sarah, his words. That is nearly all she is for him. From Bendrix's descriptions of her, one could never gather Sarah's opinions on literature, art, cinema, sports, religion, or any host of other things that people in love actually discuss. But what is love for someone like Bendrix? It is ownership, possession, and use, which is not really love at all. On the night that Sarah dies, Bendrix is invited by Henry to stay the night with him to keep him company. The next morning, as Bendrix lay awake in the guest bed, Sarah's lifeless body one floor above him, Bendrix notes that he had no desire to see Sarah's body, quote, any more than I would have wished to see her in another man's arms. He resolves then and there to fall in love again with someone else. Note the categories with which Bendrix is able to think. The undesirability of Sarah in this state is predicated on her uselessness to him and compared to her being with another man. Sarah is an object meant to be used. Her only options, according to Bendrix, are to be used by him or another. This is a far cry from Augustine's gratitude for providential encounters with others, who are seen as instruments of God's love towards Augustine. Why is Bendrix so terrible at understanding the human condition, of understanding Sarah and himself? He is, in general, an incurious person, as I said at the outset. He is dismissive of Smythe, the apostle of atheism with whom Sarah meets to talk her out of her nascent faith. Smythe is a true believer in nothing, but Bendrix is a lazy nihilist. Bendrix becomes upset when he meets Father Crompton because the latter had the answers to Bendrix's questions, quote, too pat. The amateur could never hope to catch him out. Only someone deeply committed to avoiding the truth could be mad at another for having the answers. But the culmination of all this self-deception can be seen in two final prayers. We're in the home stretch, friends, if we can call them that. First to God, and then to Sarah. And we will look to the latter, where Bendrix prays to the Sarah he didn't believe in. He cries out to her, quote, you are dead. You have God, but I'm sick with life. I'm rotten with health. If I begin to love God, I can't just die. I've got to do something about it. One can't love and do nothing. Here, Bendrix finally has the terrible insight he has avoided. The question is no longer kept at bay, papered over by tawdry affairs. Real love has finally brought Bendrix to the point of realization that love demands something of us, and that Sarah was right. All love is the love that God gives us. The possibility of our small human loves is predicated upon the love of God, even when we don't know it. But our experience of love catalyzes our soul's upward yearning and demands we face this fact. One can't love and do nothing. Perhaps the greatest irony in the book is that it was not Bendrix's love of Sarah that catalyzed this, but his love of Henry. The final book of The End of the Affair shows Henry and Bendrix living together in a rather lovely domestic situation. At the end of their workday, they begin their domestic routine, joining each other at the local pub, the Pontefract Arms, for drinks and discussions. It sounds like a very nice life to me. The impossibility of Bendrix using Henry the same way he used Sarah opens Bendrix up to a new way of love. I mentioned previously that you would know very little about Sarah by reading Bendrix's descriptions of her, but the opposite is true of Henry. Ironically, his first description of Henry is chock full of the minutiae that are known about someone in love. For example, that he refuses to wear his glasses around strangers. It is this love that has changed Bendrix. Love and real concern for another, which Bendrix never really had for Sarah. The end of the book should leave one cautiously optimistic for Bendrix's future. Readers of Flannery O'Connor will understand this sentiment well, as she is wont to drop us off just at the point of the conversion of her characters, whereupon she promptly ends the story. Greene has done much the same here with Bendrix, who has realized that if he is to answer the question, "What are you to me?" he will also have to ask and answer, "What am I to you?" The self-knowledge gained from such a question is often the incitement for radical change, as we see in Augustine's Confessions. And no doubt the latter would hold out hope for Bendrix's future. Thank you.
The Double Life of the Catholic Priest, a primer for the coincidence of opposites in the Catholic literary imagination. There are many people in this world of ours who wish to suppress all forms of mortification, penance, and reparation. They are anxious to destroy the cross and the spirit of sacrifice in the name of liberty, license, and uncontrolled pleasure. Sadly, their spiritual lives are completely barren as a result of this. No one has ever scaled the heights of perfection without the good of sacrifice. Unfortunately, some of these same people are theologians who in the latter half of the 20th century dare to assert different, and one might even say novel approaches to the priesthood and religious life. Perhaps their aspirations were innocent. Perhaps they were well-intended. Whatever the case might have been, they were naive. Insofar as the religious life was concerned, they challenged its many austerities, suggesting that corporal penances were out of date, how time devoted to prayer was wasteful, not useful, and that external activities, such as social work and business administration, were more worthwhile and in keeping with the times. With regard to the priesthood, they considered cassocks unseemly and tonsures perverse, though I might agree with the latter. In the end, they forbade the priest from wearing any outward sign of his office at all. Now, to the mind of my confrere Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, these accidental changes are symptomatic of a far more substantial change within the modern or contemporary living of the Catholic priesthood. Because, as should be made clear, it is not these accidental trappings that really define the goodness of a priest. Garrigou observes, quote, "The dearth of achievement in recent apostolic work has been due to the fact that many priests and religious have been wanting in a supernatural faith, sufficiently strong, active, deep, and infectious. Therefore, they have not been able to communicate it to a Christian people distracted by pernicious errors. This modern sterility is due also to the fickle confidence of many priests in divine help, and to their lack of ardent charity, which must be the heart and soul of any apostolate. And why has their enthusiasm for the glory of God and the salvation of souls waned? For want of the spirit of sacrifice. The priest has failed to recognize that he must be a victim in union with Christ, and that he cannot save souls except through the same means as Christ himself used. It is only this spirit of sacrifice which can rectify disorder in the soul of a priest or religious, and thus make way for a genuine charity, bringing in its train peace and joy, which spread themselves to other souls. Take away mortification, and you immediately take away joy, because once the affections of man are allowed to settle on things of sense, they can no longer be raised to God and the supernatural. End quote. With Garrigou, I believe that the classical meaning and perennial identity of the Catholic priest requires, on the part of each and every priest, an acceptance of what Fulton Sheen would later call a double life. A life lived in union with Christ, Christ Jesus our Lord, as both priest and victim. Now, in order to prove, as it were, this thesis, we could study the actions and ambitions of the saints. We could rehearse the lives of St. Dominic, St. Francis de Sales, or even secular priests, like St. John Vianney, or the servant of God, Luis Maria Martinez. Or, as I purport to do in this paper, we could appeal to perennial figures of the Catholic literary imagination, fallible products of human conjuring, to be sure, but characters nonetheless born from authentic belief, characters who are themselves appealing, convincing, and otherwise representative of what it means to be a priest. That is, a man imbued by the twin identities of priest and victim. As a kind of sidebar to all of this, the purpose of this paper is not to define the principles of the Catholic literary imagination as such, but to take them as given. Therefore, concerning the principle upon which this paper and its argument rests, the so-called coincidence of opposites, I presume that my hearers know what is signified thereby. For those unaware, however, the principle recognizes the existential mystery, if we dare use the phrase. I don't like using the word mystery unnecessarily, but I think it obtains here. In both naming and navigating opposites within the universe at large. It's a central component in any consideration of Catholic anthropology more specifically, and Catholic faith more generally. Think here of body and soul, life and death, created and uncreated, darkness, light, good, evil. Happily, this both-and orientation is present and discernible in the sacramental economy as well, as we see in the case of the priesthood. Take, for instance, this wonderful and insightful reflection on the priesthood by the Venerable Fulton Sheen, who says this, quote, "A priest is mysterious, and he is mysterious because he is amphibious. He lives in two worlds. He is at his best when he leads a double life, at once both human and divine. Because of this duality, he functions best at times of crises like our own, for his faith began in tragedy when goodness had only a cross on which to lean. Like a sailor in a storm at sea, he is dutifully climbing to the crow's nest, but looking back in fear at the thought of a fall. No life is more adventurous, for at every moment, like the trapeze artist, he is swinging between time and eternity." Wow. This is all to say, in what follows, I present an exegetical reading of the diary of a country priest, and I conclude with a final appeal to the power and the glory, during which I show how the priests found therein are themselves eminent examples of this both-and construction. In doing so, I wish to suggest the reason for why these characters are so appealing and convincing to us Catholics is that they are first and foremost perennial priest victims in their own right. First, the coincidence of opposites as it pertains to the Catholic priesthood. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, you know I had to put him in here at some point. Every priest is ordained to offer the holy sacrifice of the Mass, to offer prayers and supplications on behalf of the people of God. And yet, says St. Thomas, and yet, still more is necessary of the priest. He must be a victim as well as a priest, according to the manner and example of Christ himself. If he fails to do so, his life will be forever marked by disorder, disturbance of soul, and confusion of spirit. In such a divergence, he may remain a minister of Christ. He might show up for Mass every morning and say that Mass for the people of God, but love will be forever wanting in him. For without victimhood, the priest is no longer a man of God, but a man of the world, a man whose life has become vain, superficial, and barren. He will have entered a deplorable state of sterility. As such, every priest should ask God for the grace of victimhood, a scary prayer, to be sure, according to the pattern of Jesus Christ, to suffer patiently whatever God has willed for him from all eternity, so that his service in persona Christi might accomplish all that God has ordained for him to do. The Diary of a Country Priest. It is clear that Bernanos does not disagree with St. Thomas. The fruitfulness or sterility of the young curé's ministry depends on his acceptance or rejection of the state of victimhood. By carrying the sorrows of others in his heart, the young curé becomes more intimately united with Jesus. Bernanos often places on the lips of the young curé throughout the entirety of his work a simple but nonetheless profound prayer: suffer on behalf of others. Suffer on behalf of others. Suffer on behalf of others. This likeness to Christ, of course, is not the result of a short period of concentrated effort. There's only one way of acquiring it: through grace, years of self-denial, and the praying of prayers such as these. The priest who fails to grasp his teaching in any practical form is wasting much of his time. He is being deceived in numerous ways and understands nothing of the profundity of the mystery of the Incarnation. He is building his life on sand. In the words of St. Peter 2, Peter 1:9, he is blind and short-sighted, forgetful of the cleansing of his past sins. That is, he forgets it was only through the cross of Jesus that he was purified from his guilt. The priest, argues Bernanos, only reaches the summit of the priesthood when he is conformed to Christ as victim. Without this spirit of immolation, without carrying his cross, the priest fails to understand the full import of his vocation. Priests who have taken more than a mere speculative interest in this teaching and have become both priests and victims have met with enormous success in their ministry, and I think we all know them. I am most certainly not one of these. I am a young priest, ignorant, naive, stupid. I have not had enormous success just yet, perhaps in God's timing. This truth cannot often be repeated enough, since the modern world has little or no time for the cross, and our fallen nature encourages us to avoid it. But we see this come to bear on the life of the young curé in the Diary of a Country Priest, where he says, quote, "I believe, in fact, I am certain that many men never give out the whole of themselves, their deepest truth. They live on the surface, and yet so rich is the soil of humanity that even this thin outer layer is able to yield a kind of meager harvest, which gives the illusion of real living. How many men will never have the least idea of what is meant by supernatural heroism, without which there can be no inner life? Yet by that very same inner life shall they be judged." St. Gregory the Great once wrote, "Unless a man ceases through humility to think of himself, he never approaches the being who is above himself. Unless he knows how to sacrifice what he is, he cannot grasp what is beyond himself." In other words, without self-sacrifice, no man can possibly attain a close union with Christ. The Old Testament implies the same when it sets out the rite to be followed in the sacrifice of a Holocaust. There, the outward sacrifice was intended to signify the inward sacrifice of reparative worship, petition, and thanksgiving. And this was likewise true of Christ's shedding of blood in the sacrifice on Calvary. It is no less true of the bloodless immolation during the Holy Sacrifice, the Mass. If we take the notion of priest victims seriously, joined to this Holocaust are all the saintly priests whose lives are, so to speak, a perpetual sacrifice. No matter his state, his life should exemplify the words of St. Paul, quote, "Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified their flesh with its passions and desires." And If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Now, it should be noted here that the age of the priest does not discriminate against this transformation. And one might wonder as to why Bernanos chose a young priest for this character of both priest and victim, but I think there's something to be said there. He's trying to point to the fact that age is not something to discriminate against. Young priests as well as old might well participate in the victim of Christ, and they're called to. The Curé de Tolcy, a much older and far more seasoned priest who figures at large in this book, had this to say of the country priest. Quote, "I'm always calling you a ragamuffin, but I respect you. Take the word for what it's worth. It's a great word. As far as I can see, there's no doubt about your vocation. To look at you, you're more like that stuff that monks are made of. No matter. You may not have very broad shoulders, but you've got grit. You deserve to serve with the foot sloggers." End quote. The transformation into Jesus Christ and his veritable share in Christ's victimhood is likewise attested by the inner secret thoughts of the young curé that only his readers glean from. He writes this, "Age makes no difference, and I know that suffering speaks in its own words that can't be taken literally. It blasphemes everything, family, country, the social order, and even God. I know I have very little experience, yet I seemed instantly to recognize a certain inflection betraying some profound spiritual hurt. True pain coming out of a man belongs primarily to God, it seems to me. I try and take it humbly to my heart just as it is. I endeavor to make it mine, to love it. And I understand all the hidden meaning of the expression, which has become hackneyed now, to commune with, because I really commune with his pain. What wouldn't I give to be able to suffer? Even pain holds aloof. Even the most usual, the most humble, the ordinary pain in my inside. I feel horribly well. No fear of death. It is just as indifferent to me as life. That can't be put into words. I feel as though I had gone right back all the way I've come since God first drew me out of the void." End quote. Bernanos understood that the priest should especially offer himself as a victim when God gives him a special cross to bear. The occasion presents itself during a time of persecution, as when God makes an extraordinary intervention in order to consecrate his priest more fully, so that he becomes at the same time a perfect victim. The various trials of life might be regarded as crosses. Very often, these spiritual trials are accompanied by physical trials, bodily infirmity and sickness, and also by the desertion of friends, loss of good repute, opposition, persecution, contempt, poverty. For the young curé, of course, for those of you who have read the book, you know it was cancer. He writes, "My stomach pains have come back, fierce, intolerable. It needs an effort not to lie and roll about the floor, moaning like a sick beast. Only God can know what I am suffering." And in the conversion of Madame la Comtesse, we see how the young curé interprets his intermediary role as just that, a victim who exchanges suffering and sacrifice for the salvation of souls. For indeed, by interceding on her behalf, he suffers on her account and for her good. One of the most touching passages of this book, he writes, "Be at peace. And she, having knelt to receive this peace, may she keep it forever. It will be I that gave it to her. O miracle, thus to be able to give what we ourselves do not possess, sweet miracle of our empty hands, hope which was shriveling and my heart flowered. Again in hers, the spirit of prayer which I thought lost in me forever was given back to her by God. And who can tell, perhaps in my name, Lord, I am stripped bare of all things, as you alone can strip us bare, whose fearful care nothing escapes, nor your terrible love." Bernanos understands that a cross carried cheerfully is a great blessing from God, is a sign of our predestination, such as the cross would make us like to Christ. The saints lived up to this teaching, and a wonderful example of this is St. Paul of the Cross, who at the tender age of 30 had already reached the state of transformative union into God, which is the highest state of the spiritual life. But he lived until the age of 81, which is an extraordinary thing to think about. So he was crucified with Christ, a real victim, and for 45 years of his life, he had a cross so heavy to bear that it was often common saying in Rome, "Deliver us, Lord, from the way of St. Paul." As a final note, I wish to turn to the power and the glory of Graham Greene. And I wish to revisit that scene in which the whiskey priest is slaughtered, is put to death. And the question is an operative one, and is an open question, because one could read the passage in a way that resembles Christ, Jesus, priest and victim, and another way as not. Here it is again. Of course, there was nothing to do. Everything went very quickly like a routine. The officer stepped aside, the rifles went up, and the little man suddenly made jerky movements with his arms. He was trying to say something. What was the phrase they were always supposed to use? That was routine too, but perhaps his mouth was too dry because nothing came out except a word that sounded like excuse. The crash of the rifles. Then there was a single shot, and opening them again, he saw the officer stuffing his gun back into his holster, and the little man was a routine heap beside the wall, something unimportant which to be cleared away. The reader is left with really nowhere to turn. Did this man die a martyr? Did he die a victim after the pattern of Christ, or did he not? The lone clue that the reader is given is in a brief exchange on the very next page between a mother and a child. And that one, the boy said, they shot today. Was he a hero too? Yes. The one who stayed with us that time? Yes. He was one of the martyrs of the church. He had a funny smell, one of the little girls said. You must never say it again, the mother said. He may be one of the saints. Shall we pray to him then? What a wonderful question. Even in the lips of babes, there is a recognition that the priest should be both priest and victim. Thank you.
For this paper, I will be looking at Graham Greene's The End of the Affair, the fourth and last of his so-called Catholic novels, and T.H. White's retelling of the Arthurian myth cycle, The Once and Future King. If these books seem like strange bedfellows, then it is perhaps fitting for a talk about adultery and affairs. At first glance, it is true that they seem like unlikely comparative texts, even if they were published in the same decade. Given that this is a Graham Greene panel, I expect those here will be more likely to be familiar with The End of the Affair. Greene's masterpiece explores the relationships of writer Maurice Bendrix and Sarah Miles and her husband, civil servant Henry Miles, charting Bendrix's and Sarah's illicit union, its aftermaths, and its spiritual implications. The Once and Future King takes somewhat more explanation, even justification, for its place in a discussion on Catholic imagination. T.H. White was not Catholic, although tellingly, while writing this book, he gave serious consideration to entering the church. But more importantly, perhaps, White gives astounding life to the Arthurian world, a world for which the church's teachings and sacraments were profoundly real. The book is a sprawling epic, interweaving elements of fairy tales with complex questions of the founding of chivalric codes and civilization. But at its center are tragic and complex personal stories, most notably that of Lancelot and his affair with Queen Guinevere. These two stories, despite their apparent differences in setting, tone, and style, in fact share many threads and themes, although they often approach them from opposite directions. In The End of the Affair, Sarah and Bendrix are thoroughly modern. They make no attempt at, and even have no desire for, moral excellence. They have no relationship with God, barely even a conscious rejection of him. And their relationship begins as an affair in the tawdriest sense, one in a long line of affairs casually entered into. Yet they happen to find a kernel of real love for each other, a love which cannot be truly expressed in their illicit and modern configuration. Then, in a moment of catastrophe, God enters the picture, giving response to a prayer and a vow. The world of high ideals has come into play, and Sarah wrestles with the true reality of God, and vice falls away to be replaced by painfully hard-won virtues. On the other hand, in The Once and Future King, Arthur's kingdom is achingly and meticulously crafted to foster virtue. Words of honor, vows, expectation of conduct are held to sometimes tragic degrees. But Lancelot cannot reconcile the ideals of his age with the actions of his love affair, which is not only dishonorable, but ultimately destroys everything he holds dear. As White writes, "To a medieval nature like Lancelot, with its fatal weakness for loving the highest when he saw it, this was a position of pain. He could not bear to be made to feel that his sentiment for Guinevere was an ignoble sentiment. The hasty moments together, the locked doors and base contrivances, the guilty maneuvers which the husband's presence forced on the lovers, these had the effect of soiling what had no excuse unless it was beautiful." This key hypocrisy of the Arthurian myths is in fact spotlighted by Graham Greene in The End of the Affair, when Bendrix asks the name of the son of the private detective he hires to follow Sarah. The hapless Mr. Parkes replies that the boy is called Lance. "After Sir Lancelot, sir, of the Round Table." "I'm surprised, that was a rather unpleasant affair, surely." "He found the Holy Grail," Mr. Parkes said. That was Galahad. Lancelot was found in bed with Guinevere. It is these seeming contradictions that unite both stories. That real love might be found in sinful beginnings, and that sinful habits might persist in principled people. That old-fashioned ideas of virtue and morals might break through our modern world of self-satisfaction, and that these problems of sinfulness have plagued humanity even in our noblest myths. To begin with, we should first look at the two love stories. Despite the salacious premise of extramarital affairs, neither the characters nor the novel's readers are involved in a fantasy romance of cheap titillation. Sarah and Guinevere, the objects of desire, are without question beautiful, and yet are hardly described in ways recognizable from fashion magazines or, dare I say, pornography. In describing Sarah's particular beauty, Bendrix mentions only her broad forehead and bold mouth, the conformation of the skull. White takes his mythic characters, but instead of wreathing them in a hagiographic glow, he makes a point of grounding them in reality, focusing on them in their middle age. In one particularly moving scene, White says, "Guinevere had overdressed for the occasion. She had put on a makeup she did not need and put it on badly. She was 42. Here the paramours are viscerally real people, full of realistic and even unflattering details. The love they share for each other is not based on a self-gratifying fantasy in their mind, but truly for a person in front of them, warts and all. So much so that White takes it one step further. In one of the master strokes of his rewriting, he takes the dashing, handsome figure of Lancelot and instead gives him the face of a monster. This ugliness lies at the center of Lancelot's pursuit to become the best knight as he reacts against the thing which must have gone wrong in the depths of his spirit to make a face like that. These people, with their physical reality and depth, also have a depth of character and spirit. They recognize their own brokenness and their astonishment at finding themselves lovable and indeed beloved. Bendrix, in The End of the Affair, says, "It's a strange thing to discover and to believe that you are loved when you know that there is nothing in you for anybody but a parent or a god to love." But the novel plays out almost the reverse of this quote. It is by first loving and being loved by Bendrix that brings Sarah in contact with the transcendent love that is the person of God. Indeed, the very carnal nature of the relationship she shares with Bendrix helps her encounter the reality of the incarnation. Finding herself in a Catholic church, she reflects, "I hated the statues, the crucifix, all the emphasis on the human body. I was trying to escape from the human body and all it needed. I thought I could believe in some kind of a God that bore no relation to ourselves, something vague, amorphous, cosmic, like a powerful vapor. So today I looked at that material body on that material cross and I wondered, how could the world have nailed a vapor there? A vapor, of course, felt no pain and no pleasure. Could anybody love him or hate him if he hadn't got a body?" Encountering God as a person, rather than a vapor, renders his love for us as deeply personal. Suddenly his love is no cosmic given, but but demands a response, and in fact is infinitely more shocking than that of an earthly lover. This is the chink through which the grace enters in the end of the affair. The encountering with a real person and responding with real love prepares the heart, however resistant, to the idea of love as a transcendent reality, one which is not only personal but is in fact a person, Jesus Christ. As we might expect, the once and future king approaches from the opposite direction, as Lancelot's love for God precedes his love for Guinevere. The knight's trouble from his childhood, which he never completely grew out of, was that for him, God was a real person. He was not an abstraction who punished you if you were wicked or rewarded you if you were good, but a real person like Guinevere or like Arthur or like anybody else. Lancelot had a definite idea of what he looked like and how he felt, and he was somehow in love with this person. This makes his story all the more tragic as he spends decades torn between the god and the woman he loves. Especially as a chivalric knight, he is also deeply in touch with other transcendent realities, such as the binding nature of his honor and his word. If God, who is the Word incarnate, is real, so too are his covenants and vows, as are the vows we make to him. Sarah must reckon with this following her earnest prayer for Bendrix, a prayer which she recognizes requires sacrifice and so becomes a vow. I'll give him up forever, only let him be alive. In the granting of this prayer, she must now live out the consequences. At first, she tries to dismiss it with our modern disdain for the reality of vows. A vow's not all that important. A vow to somebody I've never known, to somebody I don't really believe in. Against this seemingly modern, rational thinking, God's hand is at work in her heart until she begins to believe, begins by hating God, because his reality requires her to keep her vow. But even in raging against him, she acknowledges, I have free will to break my promise, haven't I? But I haven't the power to gain anything from breaking it. You let me sin, but you take away the fruits of my sin. Similarly, and deeply embedded with these vows, both stories play out the real consequences of sacraments, baptism, confession, and most obviously marriage. We see the danger of entering into marriage for any lesser cause, whether that's the alliance of kingdoms or the convenience of companionship. For the vows of marriage cannot simply be wished away should true love appear, but neither can such a love be dismissed out of hand, even when found in the most illicit and impermissible of settings. For as we see in the end of the affair, love remains the unsuspecting entry point to transcendent and divine realities, one that still slips under the watch of our modern world. This is elucidated beautifully by Bendrix, who says, I can imagine if there existed a God who loved, the devil would be driven to destroy even the weakest, most faulty imitation of that love. Wouldn't he be afraid that the habit of love might grow? And wouldn't he try to trap us all into being traitors, into helping him extinguish love? But even the devil's methods of destruction point us towards God. The themes of jealousy and possession run throughout both books, and their destructive qualities are all the more potent for the adulterous lovers who cannot earnestly possess their lover. And yet this points us towards the jealous God to whom we owe our existence, and yet holds no force over us, but invites us to love him freely. Another of the devil's tools, doubt, is similarly destructive. Grappling with the uncertainty of love, the devil seeks to play on our fears and so rush love towards its destruction. The two books have several mirroring quotes in this regard. Of Guinevere in The Once and Future King, White writes, seeing so much further into the future than he did, she pressed towards it with passionate tread, wrecking the present because the future was bound to be a wreck. While Bendrix states, when the sense of insecurity, the logical belief in the hopeless future descended like melancholia, I would badger her as though I wanted to bring the future in now at the door, an unwanted and premature guest. To escape their fear of love ending, they poison it themselves, choosing despair, which always feels more certain than hope. But once again, does even that doubt and fear of the end of love not point to the answer, that our hearts are yearning for an eternal love? This is not at all to say that these stories offer saccharine slogans of true love conquering all, and that all pursuits of such love inevitably bring us closer to the divine. Rather, these stories portray an almost unbearably hard road towards God, a path complicated by it necessarily involving another person, one who is deeply loved but who must in some sense be forsaken and abandoned. Further, this other person is not hearing the call to God. They see no reason to give up their lover and so fight the ending of the relationship, using their sway to test their beloved's resolve. While one is drawing closer to God, the other feels driven away from him. We find another of those parallel quotes between the books. From Bendrix we hear, "She mixes religion with desertion to make it sound noble to herself." While of Guinevere we hear, "Holiness? Selfishness," she cried to herself, "selfish to abandon another's soul so as to save your own." And this is the key point, that the greater good and greater duty being recognized by one party does not eliminate the desires and the demands of the other. As Guinevere puts it, "It took two to make a renunciation, just as it took two to make love or to make a quarrel. But your lover's soul was not your own. It was not at your disposal. You had a duty towards it." This duty is not imagined, even if its beginning is immoral. It highlights the grave consequences, often so mindlessly entered into, of binding yourself to someone. Tellingly, Lancelot, although already racked with temptation, does not begin his affair with Guinevere until after he himself has been coerced and duped into bed with Elaine. This spurs Lancelot into despair. Having lost his purity, he may as well be impure with his heart's desire. But once entangled, he cannot again extricate himself from Guinevere and the duties of love to her, or even from Elaine. Here his pride at his moral and chivalric excellence keeps him from enacting what feels like cruelty against these women. Because God demands that we love him better than our loved ones on earth, and that we should love their eternal salvation more than their present need. The demand is to truly love and yet willfully leave, a demand requiring so much sacrifice it is hard not to find cruel. But with this extreme of moral expectations, we also find the extremes of God's love and mercy. For the love story that rests behind that of these illicit affairs is the love of God for us, his restless pursuit of our souls. As our fictional paramours here find that their love for each other transcends the earthly and reaches towards the divine, so in turn do they find that God's divine love for them reaches towards them into their earthly reality. For both these books are stories about miracles, perhaps to be expected in Arthurian romances, but even the end of the affair has almost the air of a medieval saint's life with its faith healings and apparitions. These miracles point to the way that God's love pursues us in great climactic moments, but also in tiny moments, a cough that suddenly interrupts a kiss. What compels us about these miracles is the length God goes to woo those in the depths of sin. Sarah, who never prayed and never believed, God still heard and answered her. "I said, let him be alive, not believing in you, and my disbelief made no difference to you. You took it into your love and accepted it like an offering." For Sarah, this was her first conscious encounter with God, and although painful, it marks a transformation point. But Lancelot, who loved God from the start, abandons his dream of performing miracles because it requires him to be pure of heart, and instead chooses his affair with Guinevere. Despite this, God pursues Lancelot with miracles of his own. In one of the most moving sections of the book, Sir Ur, a knight with an incurable malady, requests Lancelot to try a miraculous healing, and the crowds gather to watch, for how could Lancelot, the best knight in the world, fail? Here White writes, "Think that you know of a good reason for your failure, which you have tried pathetically to hide and overlook for 25 years. The people outside are waiting for you to do this miracle because you have traded on their belief that your heart was pure. And now, with treachery and adultery and murder wringing the heart like a cloth, you are to go out into the sunlight for the test of honor." And yet our own sins and abasements are not the end of the story, for Christ's love proves greater than Lancelot's sin. The knight is healed, and the crowd goes wild with excitement, while, in the middle, quite forgotten, her lover was kneeling by himself. This lonely and motionless figure knew a secret which was hidden from the others. The miracle was that he had been allowed to do a miracle. And there with the weeping Lancelot we find the greatest miracle of all, God's unending love for us, the realization that no magnitude of sin places us outside of God's desire, but at the same time no smallness of sin can be left untransformed and unredeemed. Even the atheist Bendrix recognizes that his pettishness and meanness are greater stumbling blocks to his redemption than his adultery. But whether great or small, our sins do not preclude us from being called to be united in love with Christ. What remains is our response. For as Bendrix says, addressing Sarah in his mind, what I chiefly felt was less hate than fear. For if this God exists, I thought, and if even you, with your lusts and your adulteries and the timid lies you used to tell, can change like this, we could all be saints by leaping as you leapt, by shutting the eyes and leaping once and for all. If you are a saint, it's not so difficult to be a saint. It's something he can demand of any of us. Leap. What is our response to this demand? Do we dare allow our corrupt and petty attempts at love to be transformed? Do we have the courage to face the demands that this transformed love places on us? Shall we shut our eyes and leap?
Well, if that was the first series of papers, you can only imagine the gift that is to come. We have 13 minutes now for conversations and questions around these essays. I do ask, especially if you can try some of your questions to link some of the essays together. That always makes for better conversation. Yes.
So, Max, can you talk about the relationship between fear of suffering and our fallen nature, and then ability to experience joy? I guess particularly, I'm thinking like Christ feared passion in some way, like he asked for suffering to go away. So it seems like fear of suffering doesn't just come from our fallen nature, but maybe it's because of our fallen nature where we need suffering to experience joy, that it becomes more important. Or I'm sorry if you can talk about that a little more.
There are a couple layers to this, and I won't get into all of them, but the first thing to say is that fear always presents itself to the soul as an obstacle in order to achieve some good, so that in the pursuit of some good, the soul experiences a movement within itself. Fear, whatever obstacle is in the way of realizing that good. And so when you think about Christ, Jesus, our Lord, perfect in every way, reasonable, rational movements, the passions, nothing is disordered or rational by his movements. One could probably invoke, as does St. Thomas, Christ's natural desire to remain alive for self-preservation, that the very notion of the cross was something to be feared because it would bring about his death. There's also to say something about the inordinate suffering that he would suffer as man. And of course, Christ overcomes that through the gift of the grace of courage as a virtue. So there's a lot to be said there. With respect to the relationship between joy and suffering, it seems to me that when one suffers on account of some good, the effect of that, or the fruit of that, is going to be an expression of joy, whether it's a natural sort of joy, when one suffers perhaps on behalf of someone they love, or a supernatural joy on behalf of God as a supernatural beloved. So I think that's an introductory response, but your question deserves a much longer one, and I would invite any one of you to write a dissertation on that.
Yeah, so this is a question for maybe both Joshua and Rachel. There's something really interesting to me in the notion of a disordered love leading a person in the right direction, but at some kind of cost of burning up what's disordered about it. And it strikes me that in some ways this process is can be very kind of halting and incomplete. I mean, in T.H. White's book, after that moment with the miracle, I'm getting a lot more trouble. I'm not so sure about the Greene, but I guess I'm just wondering, is there something here about, is it just a God can use anything, or do you think there's something particular about the fact of like romantic love, or like the particular kind of structure of the thing that they both share, the fact that it's love for another person? Is it just any disordered thing can point you towards God by God's providence, or is there something particular about this kind of love that you think has this effect?
Okay, yeah, so I think, I go to Genesis 50, what Joseph says to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. Yes, God's providence will outdo every bad thing that you bring to the table, right? He loves you more than you dislike yourself enough to sin. And so there is, I think, a particular potency, though, to romantic love, which is why, these authors tap into it. I mean, for me, the turning point for Sarah in the end of the affair is when she and Morris make honest-to-God love. And she says, I'll never love anyone like I've loved you. Right? That's the turning point. This isn't just one of her other affairs, because Henry doesn't pay attention. She now actually cares for another human being. And Morris describes it as abandoning herself. It's ecstasy, standing outside of yourself. And when you do that, you realize, like, oh, there are other things. You can't be so solipsistic anymore. God worked right in that moment, If you can love like this, guess what? The transcendent orientation of that love is me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is pretty much the sum of what I would say as well. I think, especially if you look at the end of the affair, the kind of modern world that they find themselves in is so tawdry and mundane. I think it's really summed up in the way that Bendrix and Sarah use this code word of onions to describe their love, which is so deeply unromantic, that I think love, like a real encounter with love, is one of the few things that can shake you out of that mundane reality in order to point you to the divine. Whereas I do think, like as you said, and you said in your talk as well, that the vices can resemble or like be inversions of the virtues. So I can absolutely believe that God can use anything. It's just that romantic love is one of the things that most people tend to encounter in their lives that actually might shake them out of their kind of numbness of living.
Here and then there and then there.
This is sort of for everybody on the theme of double life. Greene was really good at living the really bad kind of double life, so I think that comes up in so many of his fictions. But I love the image from Fowler's paper about the priesthood, I think from Fulton Sheen, like a trapeze swinging between time and eternity, between this kind of double life of the priest. That seems to be the expression of a kind of fullness of human life that's proper to the priesthood, but it's sort of almost delightful in its proposition. And yet on the other end would be the other kind of double life, which would seem to be the most dreadful form of tragedy, where the priest is just living a double life, the kind of bad kind of double life. So we have almost like a comic version of this, and then a tragic version of this. And my question is really, what is it about fictional priests that captures our attention so much? Because I think they do. And is there something in this kind of extreme expression of the full potential of human life and the full risk of human life that we see in these fictional priests that tells us something about human life in general, about the drama of redemption, but also about the priesthood too?
Sure, yeah. Well, one thing to be said at the very outset of this question is you receive a particular insight into the life of the priesthood when you read about a priest and his inner thoughts. You can only observe what priests do and how priests act and how priests behave and what they say. And so there's a kind of rare insight, a kind of glimpse into the heart of a priest when you read of a priest. Now, that's not something I think reserved to the priesthood. Obviously, Graham Greene and Urbananos, those two figures that I spoke of today, they had a particular understanding. I mean, they had a real insight into what the struggles of a priest would be, or at least in theory, should be. And indeed, they, I think, nailed it on the head. There is something that every priest thinks when they read Bernanos or Greene. I think there's a kind of resonance there, like this is true, this is real. And that's why it's so moving. And so I think my initial reaction is because you see what's actually going on in the heart of the priest. And often at times you don't actually know what's going on in the heart of the priest.
I'll just add a very quick comment that I'm glad that the whiskey priest is fictional. I mean, I know that he's not, that they actually exist, but there's a kind of horror. If I were to read that in a newspaper, the nice thing, though, is that the literature trains you to be more sympathetic, right? Such that when you actually meet real priests who are a bit down, I remember the first time I read The Power and the Glory, I reached for my rosary to pray for the priest who does not exist, and I thought to myself, okay, I have to remember this the next time, I find out something unsavory, or, even if a priest is just rude to me, it's like, he's a real person. So I think it helps train us to be more sympathetic.
Knowing that we have 3 minutes left and we have 2 questions, can we get both questions out on the table and then let folks answer them?
Well, thank you. It was really wonderful to hear all of you. It was very exciting to hear what you had to say. I was thinking about, there's a lot of things I have to say, I'm just going to leave into one thing. The incarnation as a kind of way of proceeding into ordered love seems to be part of Augustine, it seems to be part of certainly Bernanos and Greene. So I was just taken with the fact that it is these sexual bodies, it's the body that then makes some kind of transcendence possible, right? It's this idea of saving another person's body, of the Madame, or it's about Sarah and Bendrix, or it's about, So there's this, I guess my question is, how does that doctrine of the incarnation really kind of remind the Catholic that transcendence is not about leaving something, but it's about filling something. It's about fulfilling something. It's about bodies more than it's about going somewhere else. Does that make sense?
Yeah. My question is also like an everyone question following up on this one, like about erotic desire and desire for God. So really my question was when reading Augustine, is kind of like when he's talking about his disordered erotic desires until he converts, famously saying give me chastity but not now. Like is the source of desire, is the source for his erotic desire and the source for his desire for God the same? Because Plato seems to say in the Republic something similar, right? When he compares desire to kind of like water flowing, which can go in several directions, and that would maybe seem to be the case of the priest in the Power and the Glory.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to what you were saying. That I think it's just to make a note that I think it's really interesting, and I think that Greene does a great job of exploring that in The End of the Affair. There was one quote that I had to cut that I loved, which was about, did I ever love Morris as much as before I loved you, or was it really you that I loved all along? And I think that's so moving in seeing the destination beyond where our desires start, and that movement from where it begins, which is in our kind of corrupt nature, and goes beyond into the divine. And to say about the incarnation as well, just that, yeah, I think it's one of the really challenging things that the Catholic tradition gives to the world, which is this idea that it's not purely spiritual, that actually the body has this incredible part and is with the spirit, and it's not a case of leaving one behind so that you can fulfill the other. And I think that's really challenging, because I think our tendency is to assume that the things of the body are the things that we need to leave behind.
Yeah, I think that was well said.
Then our remaining joy is to thank our presenters for their work. So.